One of the things that's come out from the two speakers this morning has been how we can actually learn from history. So I'm going to give you a history of photographic preservation in the past. Then we're going to look at where we're at today with photographic preservation, and then where we can possibly go in the future. So here's the question. How can we send today's important digital images and historical data safely into the 25th century and beyond with a reasonable chance of success? So over the last 35 years, I've done a number of projects, which I'll tell you a little bit about, which were then and now documentary photographic projects where someone had taken pictures in 1937 or someone had taken pictures in 1888, and I went back to the same tripod spots and shot the same pictures. And these were to go into some of the country's major archives. Oops. That one. Yeah, but I was going to look a complete idiot if my new pictures shot digitally weren't around as long as the person who had taken pictures in 1888. And this was likely to be the case, as I'll say a little bit more. I think that archivally we're going backwards. We've actually reached a point where almost every photographic technical advance, as we call it, reduces the life expectancy of the image. There are one or two minor exceptions to that, but on the whole, this is in fact the case. So here is Henry Tont. You'll hear more of him in due course. He made the first ever guidebook to the River Thames photographically. And this is him in his barge and darkroom on the River Thames, which was horse-drawn. With his mistress, he's left his wife at home. Should be that bit behind. And this picture is in English Heritage's coal store in Swindon. It's an album in print. It's been there for 150 years. There's no reason why it won't be there for another 150 years as a silver gelatin black and white print. So here's a picture of my kids when they were little. He's 35 now, and I have my granddaughter, and Sean's getting married next year, and she's 28. But taking a colour print from film some 30 years ago, I'll show you what happened to another version of this print a little later. But also there is now a question about film. You know, the film that your grandparents shot on, maybe you had a 35mm camera and film yourselves and so on. The film itself is actually starting to deteriorate as well. And initially people thought this was only going to happen if you stored them in a bad attic or garden shed. But it's the news now is that it's actually more widespread and a bigger issue. So here's a digital holiday snap of mine in Greece, shot a few years ago. Who says it's going to be around in another 20 years? It's sitting on my mobile phone right now, but who says that file formats will be the same? Who says that I won't lose it when I try and migrate it to something else? Who says the hard drive with it on won't go down because I haven't backed it up in enough places? So who should be our great hero of the invention of silver salt-based photography? If you are French, you will say Louis Daguerre. Louis Daguerre, of course, invented photography so far as the French are concerned, and he made beautiful big plates on pictures on metal plates that made portraiture painting dead within a short time. However, because they were on metal plates, you couldn't easily make a copy of them. Now, of course, if you're British, you will come to think that William Henry Fox Talbot invented photography. See, French will say his camera, it was only the size of a mousetrap, which is no good, you know. And William Henry Fox Talbot will say, but I can make a book and I can paste my pictures in it. It's called The Pencil of Nature, came out in 1842. So I can do that. Try doing that with your ruddy great big steel plates in the middle of the book pages, and it ain't going to work. So that's really that argument. So here's my hero. And some of you will have heard of him, some of you won't have heard of him, Sir John Herschel. If either had been around in 1819, Sir John Herschel would be standing where I'm standing today, because he was one of these people who shortly after the Battle of Waterloo started going all over Europe, talking to people, other researchers, scientists, artists, and finding out stuff. And in 1819, randomly, because there wasn't any reason for it, they discovered that sodium thiosulfate, which was called hyposulfate of soda, dissolved away certain salts of silver, like silver bromide and silver chloride. There wasn't any great use for it, so what? In 1839, Louis Daguerre announces photography in Paris, and 3 weeks later, Fox Talbot announces his version to the Royal Society in London. And luckily, the two were different. One of them was mousetraps, and one of them was big steel lumps of, and so on. Magnanimously, Sir John Herschel gave both Fox Talbot and Daguerre sodium thiosulfate, sodium hyposulfate. So he invented the fixer. And without that, the very first pictures that were launched in 1839, you had to view in a dark room by a candlelight over the other side of the room. The picture, by the way, of Herschel is by the wonderful photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, who was probably one of the first female art photographers in the world. And this is a picture of John Herschel just a couple of years before he died. But it's interesting that he gave it to both of them, even though he was a closer friend of Fox Talbot. Might not know this. Who invented the word photography? That guy, John Herschel. Who invented the term, this is a negative image, this is a positive image? That guy. So we've got a lot to thank him for. But there's one more actual bit, which I think from an archival point of view is very important indeed, the cyanotype. Now, here's a cyanotype, beautiful cyanotype by one of my former students, Henrietta Morinaro, who got very interested in the idea of mixing printmaking and photography and looking at the crossover sort of processes involved in it. And cyanotype is a process which ends up with Prussian blue pigment on paper. So basically, it's a pigment process rather than a dye process. And okay, you're thinking, well, not that many people do cyanotype, so what? I'll show you another cyanotype, shall I? This is a cyanotype, it's called a blueprint. What's a blueprint? So every blueprint around the world is, you can say thank you to John Herschel, 1839. And they've been around for 150 years. There's one other interesting thing with cyanotypes that is important from an archival point of view. If they begin to fade, they've been in the sun for a long time, the factory was full of nasty fumes and chemicals and whatever, take a cyanotype, put it in the dark somewhere for 2 or 3 weeks, bring it out, and most of the picture will have come back again. The picture will have gone back to a dark blue. Try finding any other archival process in photography where the picture comes back all by itself if you stick it in the dark somewhere. So from an archival point of view, 1839, you've actually got a third process to Daguerre and Fox Talbot, which actually has a much longer archival life than both of them. Show you something else, very pretty picture. This is a picture by Peter Emerson a little later in the 1880s. But Herschel's tried to experiment with platinum printing because platinum is an inert chemical, inert metal, rather like gold. And platinum actually won't fade or mix in with other chemicals or whatever. Herschel didn't figure out how to do it, but some photographers in the 1880s did, and Peter Emerson was one of them. Now, this platinum print will last as long as the paper lasts. So if the paper was on a good cotton rag fiber paper and it's stored in a cold store, no reason why that print won't be around for another 1,000 years. So let's move on to the next stage of archiving photography. Another hero is Frederick Scott Archer, who sadly died in poverty because he didn't patent his discoveries. There were lots of battles around at the time and people swiping sabres at each other and people getting nasty cuts and so on. And they didn't have time in the field hospitals to stitch everybody up and so on. So what did the surgeons do? We've got gun cotton, which is gunpowder and cotton. It's used to actually put behind the musket balls and the cannonballs that you're firing. And we've got alcohol, because alcohol actually purifies wounds or keeps the surgeon happy or whatever. Yeah. So if you stir the two together, you get this gooey mixture. And when someone came in with a sabre wound, you hold together the wound, you paint on this gun mixture and alcohol, you hold it together for about 20 minutes, it dries, no more blood comes out, person hopefully doesn't bleed to death. It's better if you're lucky. And he wondered whether you could put this same gooey mixture mixed with silver bromide salts onto glass rather than onto paper, which is what Fox Talbot's original negatives were done. Because glass obviously would give you a much sharper image than the texture in paper. And wet collodion was born. Yippee, we have wet collodion. And glass plates had to be coated, exposed and developed before that chemical dried out 20 minutes later. So you only had a little window to do it. There was also another teeny-weeny little problem with wet collodion. And that is, it was explosive. And if somebody put a dark slide with a glass plate into their camera enough times, and some of the collodion got into the camera a little bit, and then you rammed another dark slide into the camera rather hard, it was quite likely to blow up. If you didn't get the chemical mixture quite right, then it was likely to blow up. So, okay, let's move on from that, because we'll come back to a little problem with nitrate film in a minute. George Eastman did not invent, or George Eastman invented the idea of coating gelatin onto glass plates rather than collodion. And that obviously was much safer. And he found a way of coating it evenly. And you could then buy glass plates in light, tight boxes rather than having to shoot, process, and get your picture all done in 20 minutes flat before it all dried up. And this was a massive advantage, of course. He then went on to, people say he invented the Kodak. Well, no, he didn't. He actually found a farmer in Wisconsin who invented the roll film back and bought the patents to that. And he invented the actual roll film that went in the camera. But what the Kodak one actually did, it was to allow the common people, us, to take pictures of whatever we liked. You know, we could be out rowing on a lake with someone. We could document our lives fundamentally. So that was special. Now, there was one problem. What George Eastman did was he needed this film that would roll up. And he thought, cellulose nitrate, that'll be fine. Cellulose nitrate was very close to the collodion that we had before. It just wasn't so gooey and was flexible, would roll up, but it was similar. So we've got a highly flammable cellulose nitrate film in all George Eastman's Kodak 1 cameras. What that means is that some of the prints survive to this day, but very few of the negatives out of that have made it through. The biggest problem with nitrate film, and nitrate film was around for a long time, 1889 through to 1951. Interestingly, it was possible that they could have used a safer film from the 1930s, but they wanted to put the safer film in aircraft so that they could do reconnaissance work without having a film that caught fire in an aircraft if it got shot at. But nitrate film is a huge problem, and anyone who's got anything to do with any archive or museum, I'm actually going back to my old school next Tuesday to look through for tins that might have Sports Day 1947 written on them, because it's very likely that there'll be nitrate film. And nitrate film actually goes back to being a gooey mass like that, which is extremely explosive and contains, and you can't put foam on it, you can't put water on it to put it out, because so many oxygen molecules actually in the material itself that it's self-sustaining, it's self-igniting. Let's just give you some idea. Now, look, I'm not a chemist, but have a look at that chemical formula for cellulose nitrate film. Now have a look at the chemical formula for nitroglycerine. Start to see a little in common out there, just a little bit. Okay, so then safety film was invented, and safety film was actually invented in 1910. But because the movie industry had got so into using the nitrate film, it continued to do that. And then the 1930s, as I said, you know, all the safety film went into war and reconnaissance planes and things like that. And it was about 40 years later, it was about 1950, by the time you actually got safety film becoming the normal rather than the nitrate film. And this was despite the fact that you'd be in a cinema somewhere in the deepest west or somewhere, and the nitrate film would get stuck in the gate of the projector with lots of light and heat shining on it, and the cinema would burn down. It could do that sort of thing. There's also cases, including a couple of big George Eastman archive in the United States, 1976, where the archive, they had fire doors and everything. What they didn't expect was the archive would self-ignite from inside because of the nitrate film. So if any of you have got anything to do with any archives anywhere, go into the archive, look for tins, film tins that have, it's mainly film that's curled up, that's the problem. Go and have a look for anything that says pre-1950. And if you find any, don't open it, get your gauntlets, get your goggles, walk outside, place it in a large field and run like hell. Now, okay, so we have safety film, yippee. The euphoria from safety film lasted a whole 10 years. When up comes Kodak, get an email, we don't get an email, they get a letter saying from the Indian government saying, you know, this new film of yours, well, we just opened a can of it that's been in a rather hot warehouse for a few years, and it's gone crinkly, and there's this amazing smell of vinegar.
Yeah.
And cellulose acetate film is a problem to this day. Here's what happens with safety film if it's badly stored. So all the film that you've ever shot, your parents or grandparents have ever shot, is probably cellulose acetate film. And cellulose acetate film, what happens is that the film breaks down into acetic acid molecules that attack the dyes in the film, if it's a color film, and actually makes the gelatin surface that's got the emulsion on it a different size to the base, and that actually lifts one from the other. This makes it very difficult to use a flatbed scanner on them, by the way, and things like that. So this is called the vinegar syndrome, and a lot of archivists know about it, and a fair number don't know about it. Interestingly, the effect can worsen very, very quickly indeed. It's something which, once it starts, you can't stop it. And if you've got any stuff that's stored in an attic or in a garden shed, for example, rather than in a chemical climate controlled condition, then it can go very, very quickly, and you're likely to make it very difficult indeed to actually rescue the things at all. There's a recent paper, 2022-23, by UCL's PhD candidate Ida Ahmed and Dr. Catherine Curran, that suggests that many acetate films, movie and still, may only have a life of 30 to 50 years, even however you store them, even in climate-controlled conditions. So all of you who've got nice pictures of Kodachromes and slides and films from your childhood and whatever, beware. So I showed you a picture earlier on. Here's my kids again. Only this picture, we just had a frame that only took in their faces. And look at what's happened to the rest of it. And this wasn't in direct sunlight. It's in our dining room, and it's not direct sunlight. And yet that print has faded. There's lovely stories about the house that wouldn't sell in the estate agent's window, and the sun's beaten down on the estate agent's window, and you know that house hasn't sold because it's all gone red, because the cyan dye is the one that's actually faded, and you end up with pictures with a red cast. Okay, so what was needed, and this was very important, this was started up in the 1970s odd, was how can we have an organisation that can tell us that one material is more archival than another, or which can do rapid testing to actually simulate a life in a number of years? And the answer is called the Wilhelm Institute. And if you're interested in archiving at all, then this is a name that you should know, because the Wilhelm Institute not only does its own research, but collects data from other people all over the world. And initially it started to do it on Fuji and Kodak and Agfa color films, you know, C-type films and prints. It now does it on digital paper and digital inks and so on. So one can actually find the best combination for the longest archival life. But they are the font of all knowledge, the Wilhelm Institute, and I thoroughly recommend them. Okay, so there's a little bit into the journey into the past. Let's go a little bit more into the present. These are a couple of projects of mine and the way that we tackled them. So this is London's Found Riverscape project. I was in the Museum of London way back, 1994. And they'd just been handed over the collection of the Port of London Authority because they were moving to a smaller headquarters building. And amongst the dust-ridden archive, there were these 4 beautiful blue leather-bound folders. And when you opened them up, there was in 2.5-meter lengths a complete panorama of both banks of the River Thames. One print on another print on another print, black and white. 1937, so it was 2 years before Docklands got clobbered during the Second World War. So it's a very important historical record. So we got this daft idea, myself and Mike Seaborn from Museum of London and Charles Craig, who was Dean of the School of Media at LCC at the time, that for the millennium, we would reshoot this. Now, this 1994-1995, digital photography wasn't as good as the guy who shot it in 1937, because he shot it on 6.5-inch by 8.5-inch glass plates, and digital wasn't nearly there good enough to do it. So we knocked on Fuji's door instead and said, can we borrow one of your 6 centimetre by 17 centimetre panoramic cameras? Will you fly us a 300mm lens in from Japan? And they said yes. And then we said, couldn't give us a couple of 100 rolls of Fujichrome 120 film, could you? And they said yes. And I said, well, got to process it now. I said, oh, look, we'll fix the Daily Telegraph down on Docklands and they can process all your film for you. So everyone was very nice to us about this. So all going swimmingly. We shot it on film in 1997. Film is in the Museum of London. Might only have a life of 30 years now, we've discovered, thanks to this PhD bod, but there we go. Anyway, thought that project was over. And it had been a very successful project for us to do. And you can see how you could compare one little bit of it with another little bit. Interestingly, to make the print here, we used a piece of really cutting edge technology at the time, which was we actually digitized the 6 centimeter by 17 centimeter film. And then we used a special enlarger, which fired 300 DPI, blue, green and red lasers onto conventional color printing paper. So it was making tiny dots onto color printing paper, and then you process the color printing paper normally. And it was a system that wasn't around for very long. OC Lightjet and Durst had a similar system as well, but it was pretty cutting edge at the time to actually fire tiny lasers onto make color prints. Out of the blue, 2006, we get the Port of London Authority come back to us and say, hey, you know that panorama you made 10 years ago? It's our 100th birthday in 2009. Could you just patch it up? Could you take, the little bits that might have changed? Could you sort of fit them in and do them? So we took a look down the river. We went down the river on a riverboat. It's a jolly good thing to do, great fun. And we looked for things that might have possibly changed, like the Seacon place that actually took in large reels of newspaper for the making of printing in Wapping. So there's Seacon now. And as we went down the river, everything had changed. There wasn't anything that hadn't changed, really. So we had to start again. By this time, we could actually shoot using digital photography because digital was good enough in 2007 for us to match what had gone before. This time we went to Canon and said, can we borrow one of your perspective control lenses where you can move the lens field over to the left, move the lens field over to the right, stitch the two together and make a long panoramic picture. We're still working with a long lens rather than a wide angle lens, because a wide angle lens will give us distortion and the same bloody skyscraper will appear 4 times if you're not careful. So you're working with little tripod spots and a long lens going right the way down the river. We made an original book, London's Riverscape, Lost and Found, and there's myself and Mike actually shooting with the Canon. So that we use that as reference. So we had a meeting with the chair of the Port of London Authority, and he happened to say, Graham and Mike, you know that 1937 panorama that is now in the Museum of London's coal store? Do we think that's going to be around for our bicentenary in 2109? And we thought, well, sitting in a coal store, silver gelatin prints, yes, it would have a good fighting chance. So we said yes. And then he said, and the new digital panorama that we've just sponsored you £15,000 to make, that will of course be around in 100 years' time, won't it? At which point we looked at each other, Mike and I, and went, would you like to sponsor us another £5,000 to print our digital panorama? And that's what we did. The entire panorama. They gave us another £5,000, and you can see here the chair of the Port of London Authorities, the gentleman at the back with the white hair, and this is the guy who was the head of the Museum of London. And we made a total copy so that you could lay out each bit of the 1937 and each bit of our one, and you could compare like for like. And by pigment ink printing onto cotton rag paper, then yes, this should be around in 100 years' time for their bicentenary. We even made blue leather folders, just like the original 1937 one. And here's the chair of the Port of London Authority handing over one of our 4 panorama folders to the Museum of London. The wacky picture in the background, I'm sure you'll notice it, is part of the Port of London Authority's collection when they were getting policemen to test new life jackets. And these 3 poor sods had to jump into the top. But the point is, we were giving the Museum of London artifacts for them to look after into the future, rather than just digital data. Yes, they've got the digital data too, but the artifact, museums know how to look after artifacts, otherwise our museums wouldn't have very much stuff in them, would they? So therefore, giving them artifacts is a good idea. Another project that we got involved in was in the footsteps of Henry Tont. Henry Tont was an Oxford-based photographer who in the 1880s made the first ever photographic guidebook to the River Thames. And he stuck little tiny photographs into each picture all the way down. There were 23 spreads like this and all the history and information. And there's Henry standing outside what is now the River and Rowing Museum in Henley. What isn't so well known, if you've ever heard of a book called 3 Men in a Boat, by Jerome K. Jerome, Henry Tont's guidebook was you get a skiff from Putney, you get it put on a train, you take it to Oxford or Lechlade in Gloucestershire, and you row genteelly down with the tide and with the stream and stop off at these pubs and all the rest of it. In 3 Men in a Boat, you read it, you'll find that these people set out from Putney against the tide and the stream, going straight up the river, and they finally got as far as Pangbourne before they abandoned the boat. Montmorency, the dog, had got off at Windsor. Anyway, there we are actually shooting this with my colleague Jeff Robbins, and we were very lucky that just at the time, Phase 1, which is one of the companies that do the highest resolution digital camera backs you can get, had a new machine called a light phase. And the light phase was the first machine of its time, this is 1998, that you could a digital back for a Hasselblad, and you could take it out of the studio and not use mains, but use battery to shoot. And it needed a firewire, and Sony let us one of their latest Veo laptops for it. So we had this amazing equipment. There were only 3 of the light phase in the country. Phase 1 kept 1 for their own use. We had 1, and Patrick Litchfield had the other one. So we had some lovely days round at Paddy's studio, actually comparing notes on things. He was very generous with the wine. A lovely man. Anyway, so this was the output from the Henry Tont, an exhibition in the River and Rowing Museum, pictures, and a book, River Thames Revisited, by Francis Lincoln. Also, I ended up doing radio and television interviews and stuff like that, so it was great fun. We were sponsored to we insisted that we were going to make pigment ink prints again of everything, because, again, if we were going to look Muppets, if the London's Riverscape 70 years earlier lasted longer than ours, we were going to look complete idiots if Henry Tont's pictures from the 1880s lasted in the Swindon coal store longer than our digital data files. So we insisted on making digital images, and this basically Oxford Heritage Centre, River and Rowing, and Heritage England all have a copy of it. Another project, and this is where we get into the future. This is my way of scanning slides, which isn't a flatbed scanner at all, because if you've actually got pictures that have got the crinkly vinegar syndrome, then you can't use a flatbed scanner on them because they'll go in and out of focus. If you've got a good digital camera and you hitch a decent macro lens on it and you mask it around and all the rest of it, and you do some sneaky fiddles with some of the settings on the camera, then you can actually shut the lens down far enough to get a depth of focus with the crinkly film, and you'll get a very much better result. So I was sitting on a train one day and this guy comes along and says, oh, I'm a photographer too. And he says, I've reached the end of my career. I'm going to leave University College, Oxford, 44,000 of my Kodachrome slides. They've been in the attic for 15 years, but I'm sure they'll be great. There won't be a budget to, I'm sure that a rich college like University College, Oxford will be able to afford to scan them all. And I thought, poor sods, they are going to have to, you know. So I basically said to the guy, I can be like the first officer on the Titanic. I can save 400 of your 44,000 images, if you like. And I digitized 400 of his pictures, went to see the archivist at University College, Oxford, and basically, there's the technicals on the camera. I actually hitched a modern Fuji X Pro camera to a 1979 macro Nikkor lens with an adapter, because that was the sharpest macro prime lens that ever existed in the days of film. And so from there, we printed out everything using a pigment ink printer, which I'd acquired from Hewlett-Packard, borrowed for a fortnight, still got it in my room today, but I forgot to give it back. But that's a story for another day. And you can see the sort of quality of what we could get. So the idea was that we put into archive these pictures along with their accession numbers and their captions, because what a lot of museums are doing is they're putting all their big photographic files on one server and all the information and context about the picture on a database somewhere else. And when you start having to migrate things through the cloud and change file formats, and you know how often you have to upgrade databases and so on, the kiss of death is either you're going to get an amazing picture and not know what it's about, or you're going to get this terrific description of an amazing picture, but no picture. So this is what we did. We thought of something else as well. We could actually make some of the pictures different sizes. So we could tell a curator in 200 years' time, sitting in University College, Oxford, which were our favourite pictures, rather than them choosing for us in 200 years' time. And we could do other things. We could actually write a set of notes saying, please save our pictures, more or less, or why we've done it this way, and plead and beg that they would send them on to other people. And there's our box of tricks. There is another story that goes with that box of tricks, but I'm going to save that for Wednesday night to creative computing suite. But there's a reasonable chance with a college like University College Oxford that's worth 4 billion that their archive, these pictures, there's no reason why they won't be around in 2723, 3023, whatever. They've actually got pictures in there that are pigment on paper that date from 1260 and 1371. So what I'm doing is I'm using a known technology to send pictures into the future, because we know it's a known technology because the stuff that's pigments on paper that's been there for the last 700 years. So what might go wrong? Well, expensive RAID disk systems are great. High capacity servers are great. Storing the pictures all over the planet is great. Most museums conform to 300 dpi uncompressed TIFF files in Adobe RGB, Adobe DNG files for RAW and PDS for documents. 1 or 2 museums choose other formats, and 1 or 2 museums have had to redo all their pictures and resave all their pictures because they went for something like JPEG 2000, which only 1% of the museums in the world support. So what might go wrong? We're basing 4 big assumptions. Number 1, every time we make new photographs, every time we do new research, everyone in this room, there will be space in either our universities or our museums to take our new project into archive. All of us around the world are all sort of saying, you know, whether it's pictures of kids, your kids or whatever, you know, you're building up more and more pictures all the time. Is there going to be the space to go on putting them in? But future advances continue to use TIFF and JPEG. What happens when AI formats start to really use their own format because TIFF or JPEG isn't the most convenient format? What happens with a quantum computer rather than a binary computer? Who says it's going to use the same file formats? What happens if we use wetware? What happens if we start storing our images on DNA strings? You know, it's very likely over the next 25, 50 years that TIFFs and JPEGs won't be supported rather than will be supported. If you were a graphic designer and you had pictures that you did in 2007 in Adobe InDesign CS3, you now can't open it in Creative Cloud. So that's actually the same program, let alone anything else. There's no errors in migration. Think of all the sort of banks that have nearly gone down because somebody put the wrong RAID disk in. Think of solar flares and the warning that solar flares, actually they knocked down the power in North America a few years ago, I recall. But supposing the cloud these days relies on satellites rather than cables under the sea. Cyber attacks. How do you destroy a country's morale? Well, you actually take away their culture. I think Winston Churchill's reputed to have said something about that. Finally, our great-great-grandchildren will like our stuff long enough to actually want to save it rather than slip it into that little trash can down in the bottom left-hand corner. So, okay, you may not have acquired a 24-inch, 12-ink Hewlett-Packard pigment printer. How are you going to actually save your work? Well, the answer is, in my opinion, self-published books. You can actually, here's one, I've got it out the front here, I'll show you, I'll do this pretty quickly. You can make Blurb, for example, use a Hewlett-Packard pigment toner as their ink, which is pretty much the same as what I used to go into University College, Oxford. They use a Mohawk from Canada cotton rag paper, which is pretty much the same as the Canson rag paper that I used to go into Oxford. So this book that I've made of my ancestors for my children and my grandchildren has a life of 300 years at least. So the idea that I've got for you all, just to really round this bit off, is you can make beautiful books, you can pass them down to people. If you make them beautiful, people will save them for longer. People will look after them. You can tell stories. You can get stuff from ancestry, you can get stuff from heirlooms, you can get stuff from oral histories. And this is a way of putting them all in one place and making the complete story. So Wiltshire and Swindon History Centre saw this book and loved it so much, they said, could they have a copy? So that means that my 4 times great-grandmother, Mary Braxton, born in 1764, is likely to go into this museum. Book's going to last 300 years. So Mary Braxton is time travelling over a 600-year period. So the conclusions. Today's photographers, artists and researchers, this is you folks, the museum curators, should consider making pigment ink printed records in their 20s of the work they're doing then, in their 40s, in their 60s, because it's unlikely when they hit the tender age of 72 like me, that the work they did in their 20s will still be around. So if you actually want to document your life, your research, your future, then making a book, something like 70 quid to make one book like this. Maybe you can, and because you can self-publish, you can make just 3 or 5 or whatever to put into different places and get a couple of them in the university's library, whatever. So this is a cheap way of actually sustaining your research and keeping your research and telling future generations about your research in case something that you research now actually fires something wonderful in future, which is what can happen with Eva. A lot of museums and archivists use born digital images and aren't really aware of the fact that it is the most fragile form of photography archiving that has ever been invented, which hopefully from today I've been able to convince you. And far from digitizing artifacts to save them, which is how a lot of museums actually get funding, it's far more likely that the original artifact will vastly outlive the digitized copies expensively made in order to preserve them. Digitizing gives us wider access, yippee, but it doesn't give us longer life. There's a horrendous story about a small museum somewhere in deepest America, and I'm not going to go into details even if I knew them, that had a load of Brady Civil War pictures and they had to make the museum smaller. So they digitized them and then tore them all up. And when someone like me turned up and said, hey, you know, you're going to have to do this again in 25 years' time because we'll probably be in different file formats and whatever, a pile of ash. So this is something you're going to look at. And that's really my bit.